Hello, everyone. My name is Charlie Rodnuson, and I'm a practice coach with the Academy of Professional Excellence to the San Diego State Research Foundation. I'm so excited to bring to you the Academy I3 podcast. This is a series of podcasts where we lead with open hearts and open minds to inspire, inquire, and impact the workforce. Welcome back, listeners, to the Academy I3 podcast, brought to you by the Academy of Professional Excellence. We are brought to you by a special guest today, and really to talk a little bit more about the topic of cultural humility. This was the first person I thought of, especially when thinking about this topic, and I really wanted to bring her on. She's a former colleague of mine and forever, a friend as well. And so I'd love to be able to introduce Janice Boafo, and I'll turn it over to her to introduce herself.
Hello, hello. Thank you very much for having me. If you can't hear it in my voice, I am smiling really, really hard. I'm excited to be here. I'm grateful to be with you. And my name is Janice Boafo. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I previously worked in child welfare as an investigative social worker and a child and family team meeting facilitator. And now I do coaching and training across the state for social workers, for supervisors, and also for resource parents. So I'm really excited about that work. I also am the CEO of Evergreen Cypher Incorporated, and I'm an adjunct faculty in a substance use disorder certification program. So I'm sprinkled a little bit everywhere. I'm also a mom of four sons, so it's a little bit of my role.
Yeah, it sounds like you're doing everything under the sun and you're very involved. So, I mean, I think within your roles, like there's so many different aspects that you play within each of those roles. And so like, where do you feel yourself to be the impact that you have within those different roles?
I think the common thread across all of the things that I do is about creating spaces for reflection and dialogue. I think that's really um, one of my gifts, one of the things that excites me, and one of the places that I think there's the most impact is to really be able to be present with folks and to open up a little bit of space in things that are maybe a little more scripted for reflection, for dialogue, for consideration of other points of view, as opposed to just the business of the work.
Yes, that's incredibly powerful, especially in all aspects, whether that might be within the professional sense or even, coaching others to work with families as well. It's such an important aspect to have that space, because then with that space, it allows others to bring in their whole self into the picture too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of my sort of mantras, and one of the things that I consider, that I introduce, that I go back to, is the idea that we bring our whole selves into work. We bring our whole selves into everything that we do. And that's what excites me about sort of this cultural humility, cultural responsiveness approach, is the fact that we get to acknowledge it, as opposed to pretending that there is some type of separation between our full selves and our professional selves. And really the idea that those two are meshed together, and we bring them into every space, but asking ourselves the question around, do we make room for them? Do we consider them? Do we invite them into the conversation? Or is some of our time kind of spent boxing out some of the other elements of ourselves to fit a mold of what is a professional role? I mean, what do we lose when we do that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, you're already getting us started, which is awesome. And so let's dive in. Let's start to talk a little bit more about cultural humility and cultural responsiveness for you and sort of for our listeners. Where do you find the value of cultural humility and cultural responsiveness, and why is it important?
I think that a good starting place is about honoring ourselves, about being genuine, being authentic in our experiences with one another. And so the value for me is, to me, it really is about truth. It is about learning and growing. And we're in this ongoing process of growth and learning and change. And so, in being culturally responsive and being culturally humble, we think about ourselves first. We consider who we are and sort of how our experiences, personal and lived experience, lived experiences and professional experiences, have brought us to exactly where we are. And knowing that, reflecting on that, kind of being grounded in that, allows us to connect more authentically, more wholly, more openly with other folks that we're in community with. So whether it be, a stakeholder or a family that we're serving or a colleague, I think that this is just a really good starting place to better understand each other and to communicate more clearly.
Absolutely. And then, part of it is being able to have that interplay of, valuing ourselves and being able to value others as well. And through that, there's sort of something that we talked about offline, which is that human connection, being
Mhm.
able to have those honoring of both and then having that human connection. So can you speak a little bit more about just sort of like how cultural humility and cultural responsiveness could be rooted in that human connection piece?
Yeah, I think that cultural humility, cultural responsiveness is all about the connection. It's all about being able to authentically see and hear people. Um, One of the challenges of our minds, our fabulous minds, is that we make assumptions, we have biases, positive, negative. We have sort of this whole continuum of putting people and experiences into a hierarchy and into boxes. And approaching with cultural humility and cultural responsiveness to me says, let me not take all of those assumptions and allow them to shape my experience of you. Let me really be here in the room with you. Let me consider myself and sort of like what's activating me? What am I responding to? What are my assumptions? And then let me see you as an individual so that I'm really present in the moment with you. And that requires a lot of vulnerability. That's that connection piece. And I know for some people, it maybe sounds a little like airy fairy and hocus pocusy and like, oh, this is a lot of feelings, but it's really about getting to the heart or the truth of the conversation and the connection. So applying this with colleagues doesn't mean that we're hugging each other at the end of everything. It's about, did I hear what you said from you, Charlie, right? Like from really hearing your words and your experience. Or did I have like a perception of how it was going to go and then I allow that to shape things? Um, so I think it's a lot of being open to possibility.
Right. And there's a lot of, ability to be able to offer that to others. And especially in instances where, some folks may not be ready for that, especially if we're in sort of a working culture and, let's just say we're at a place where we want to offer that space, we want to bring that. Whereas others, they're still new to that. They're still shifting to that. They're still having, like you said, biases may come up or, the culture may not be there. Like, so how can that work start to happen? Let's just say, first, maybe with ourselves. Like what do we need to do for ourselves to be able to step into that work? Are there some, I guess, tips or ways that we can get started with that?
That's a really good question. I think it's important to start with the consideration that we have privilege in our environment. So there are different workspaces, different work environments, different relationships that privilege us to have the opportunity to practice vulnerability. So it is really, really important that we're honest with ourselves about what culture, sort of what microculture in our team or our unit or our agency we are operating in. And for sustainability, for self-care, for self, protection, consider, are we in a relationship that allows us to be able to practice some of that vulnerability? So I think much of the work of being culturally humble starts with that self-reflection. It starts with understanding where we are in life, in our relationship to one another. So I had a training yesterday, and there were a bunch of new social workers. And some of the conversation, it was a line worker core training. So some of the basic onboarding training for new social workers. And they were a really exciting group. I was all smiles and pumped up and excited about them because they had lots of creativity and lots of ideas and lots of questions. And we got into a conversation about them going off topic a little bit and asking about some imbalances and resources and asking about opportunities to engage in some what I would see as social justice work. So really advocacy on the behalf of folks who have do not hold as much power or who don't have as many opportunities. And they asked lots of why questions. And then the scope and kind of the size of the challenge in front of them began to seem like it was feeling overwhelming. We circled back to this idea of your 15%. And I'm giving this example because it connects to the idea of what is your environment. So we considered, what is your 15%? So this research that talks about, and it came out of working in the car industry, but it's this research that says in your workspace, there's 85% of things in the larger system that are outside of your control. 15%, sometimes less, depending on the culture of an organization, is within your sphere of influence. It is essential to understand first, though, before you're able to make a move and have an impact in that 15%. And this is kind of where our group went yesterday. It's essential for you to understand your role and your scope before you can figure out how to move and how to make an impact in your 15%. What contributes to that as well is this idea of who do you need to be in relationship with? What environment around you needs to be cultivated, nurtured, strengthened, or even just to be there to allow you to practice vulnerability, to be able to learn and grow, to be able to practice some of this cultural humility, cultural responsiveness. And so the closing of this conversation with these new social workers really was, what is your relationship with each other? Who's got your back? Who can you ask, hey, am I missing something here? Or, ooh, I feel like I just put my foot in my mouth. Can we break this down? Can you openly, honestly, with respect, tell me where you would have done something different, or there was a misstep, or what am I missing? And what's your relationship with your supervisor? So that to me is kind of the idea of what does your environment look like? Are there people that you're in relationship with, that you're in teams with, that you're in partnership with, that you can practice some of these elements to be able to stretch yourself? Like that to me is the cultural responsiveness, cultural humility piece, understanding where you are situated in an environment, and then looking at what you'd like to do, where you have the ability to have some impact, where you want to learn and stretch and grow, and then who is in partnership with you, who can you bounce ideas off of to continue to kind of sharpen and understand better the differences of the experiences of the folks around you. That was my long answer to your question.
No, I thought I love the analogy that you brought in as well, and also sort of the intentionality of seeing all the different layers of it. There, like you said, there has to be sort of that the reflection on the time, the space, the who you're in relationship with, because all those are so important to reflect on and part of one's inner work as well, because you're having to really stop and ask those questions of like, how do I honor myself? How do I want to show up in relationship with others? And then also, how do I allow myself to then be able to have that in being able to offer it to others, especially if they're not in that place and time where they're ready as well, because then you want to give them that grace to be able to like, okay, well, maybe I'm building up to this. Maybe I'm able to find a way where I can honor my own self. And when I'm ready, there's the next time where I can sort of bring that into the fold in relationship with other people. So it's such a like evolving dynamic, process, it sounds like.
Which I feel like is the exciting part of it, and the opportunity of it is really dynamic. Much of this work is inner work. This is you stuff. This is me doing my work. And then there's a little bit of magic in it. It's sort of this perfect storm of coming together intentionally with someone else who is willing to be a partner in this with us. I think it is just sort of going back a step. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that not everybody has the benefit of having an environment. Again, I guess having an environment that makes this facilitation of this process easy. So I just want to acknowledge and normalize the fact that not all workspaces are spaces where individuals can wholeheartedly engage in this process. And I don't want to discount those experiences. I think that there is still an opportunity to see incremental change and to hear people and to engage in our own self-reflection, and to see change through this process, even in those difficult environments. But it's going to be a different sort of navigation. I think that's the sort of organic, dynamic element of it, is slowing down a little bit to get a lay of the land, to reflect for ourselves, to do that inner work. I'm reading a book right now, and it's, what is it? The boy, the mole, the fox and the horse. Have you heard of that book?
No, I've never heard of that book.
It's sort of a little picture book, and it's got this nice handwritten writing. And in one part of the book, and it's lots of just little reflections, this boy is kind of going through the world, the big open world. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing, he says something to the effect of, isn't it interesting that all we can see is our outside when everything happens on the inside? Mm-hmm. So to me, that sums up very much the work of cultural responsiveness, the work of cultural humility. We have a snapshot of others in our world. We have a snapshot of understanding another experience. That's the outside of things. That's that peripheral sort of experience. That's that initial layer of understanding one another. And then there are all these inner thoughts and assumptions and experiences. And those really are the powerful pieces that shape if we're able to get a little closer to one another and have some conversation. Yeah.
I think a lot of what you mentioned just now was that, because you brought it up earlier, which was the level of vulnerability that it does, lean into, because, for some, some may be ready, some may not be. And it also is dependent on how much of that inner work that we've tried on ourselves, because at the same time, like you were saying earlier, that certain organizations, there is that environment, certain organizations there may not be. And we also, when we show up into that, I think a word that you've brought up offline before is, we don't want to be disingenuous. We don't want to be sort of not authentic to ourselves, and also we don't want to be faking it as well, because that doesn't seem very authentic. So how does that then come up to be where, when we're showing up to an organization, or we're in an organization, and let's just say how we interact with others may bring up something within ourselves, like we may experience some of that countertransference, or we may be activated. So then how do we approach that from a sort of a cultural humility or cultural responsiveness approach, if that were to happen?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's important for us to understand how we respond to stressors. Putting that into a cultural context for ourselves. And I think that it's important for us to really have a sense of boundaries and lines in terms of how we demonstrate self-respect. So I'm just sort of thinking about this idea of mutual respect. And one of the essential elements of cultural humility is that we start with ourselves and then we move outwards. I think another important element is this consideration that we're not going to necessarily agree. And we may not always understand each other. I think that one of the misunderstandings around these concepts are that we are going to get to this beautiful, glorious, like rainbows and sunshine agreement, and that it's about winning someone over to our point of view or taking on their perspective, when it's really that space in between. So what you made me think about was really questions that we ask ourselves all the time, because I think much of this work is about this powerful questioning and asking ourselves questions. For me, one of the questions is, how do I demonstrate respect for myself? And sometimes that looks for people like stepping away from this. It's okay to not be ready to engage in this process. It is really important that we are able to be honest and model self-preservation, self-care, but continuing to ask the questions of, if I step away from this process, if I quiet down, if I do whatever for me is protective, am I shutting down, or am I acknowledging that I've got something that was activated or triggered and I need to do a little bit more work before I can respectfully proceed and continue to engage in this process with someone else? I think a lot of it is self-reflection about what is being activated in me, reminding myself that it's often not about me, but if I'm impacted by it, what's going on with me, right? So taking ownership and responsibility for the process. And I really like the concept that was introduced to me by a couple of folks at the academy of the survival window. I think that that's a powerful concept. And the survival window basically says that there are times when we are experiencing something and that something is overwhelming, whether it leads us to grief or to frustration or to anger or kind of just being frozen, not being able to move and make a decision. We've got the skills. And I think this is part of honoring what we know. We all have got these skills and these qualities and these attributes that allow us to navigate challenges successfully and move forward. And there are some things that overwhelm our ability to cope. It could be just sort of the perfect storm of timing, of world events, of family stuff. And this is the part about you bring your whole self to work, right? So it could be something that's going on in the media, something that's going on in your workplace environment, things that are going on in your physical self, because we're not disconnecting the mind and body. We're also taking all of that into work. And there are times when we have to allow ourselves to honor that we're not in a good headspace to make a decision. We are not a really good partner in the conversation. We're not yet ready to be hopeful or positive or solution focused. We just have to sit in our experience of whatever that range of emotions is. And that's that survival window. So the analogy is that the house is on fire and you're sitting at the windowsill and you've got like first responders, there's a ladder, there's a big old pool of water, there's a floaty thing you can jump on. They've got all these options and people are going, yeah, you can do it. Those people are great when you are ready to be in partnership with them and you two both are sort of on a similar emotional wavelength. And that doesn't mean you have the same culture, doesn't mean you have the same point of view. It doesn't even mean you have the same ideas about resolution, but you're open to seeing options. You're open to engaging in this conversation and moving forward. And it's okay to not be ready. It's okay to not move forward and to not be open. And to just be sitting in the window. The house is on fire. You can feel the heat. It's kind of singeing you. You know, you got to do something different. And you're not ready to move into collaboration, partnership, talking it through, making a decision. Moving when you're not ready to do that is what leads to often these disingenuous sort of like this artificial harmony they talk about in org health. So it leads to this idea of artificial harmony where we nod and smile. Oh, it was a great decision. Oh yeah. And it's palatable. You can feel this energy of disagreement or of not really being fully wholly there and present in the space, but we're moving along because somebody was pushed through the survival window when they weren't ready. And the impact of that is we have to go back and end up doing the work. We're being disrespectful to ourselves. We are being disingenuous and disrespectful to the group and the group process, and sacrificing that to get to an endpoint of making a decision or having sort of a concrete outcome. And so I think part of this is about acknowledging that we don't have to be ready. Some things take more time. Acknowledging it with ourselves first and then finding a way to communicate it to the larger group. And the other part is about in our work in, with families that we work with colleagues, with, people that are over us or that we supervise, to check in on the process and the content piece. How we do what we do is part of this culture of humility mindset, and is as important as the outcomes that we arrive at. So checking in on both of those, and that to me is an essential element about being culturally responsive, is that there is much in the workspace that is acculturated to outcomes. Like we have to deliver something. which is steeped in a cultural background. And that is not the norm for everyone. We have a lot more of collaborative communities where the process and how we engage with one another is essential to the work. So an example is in doing coaching, there was a group I used to coach, and we'd start a meeting. We'd have a scheduled group coaching, and the meeting would start. People would always bring snacks. So food was an element of this group. This was this group. They brought their snacks to the meeting. It didn't even matter what time of the day it was. They brought snacks. So they're breaking their snacks open and sort of, and then they checked in with each other. And there was this very obvious checking in, orienting, hey, how you doing? Process, regardless of what the titles and roles and hierarchy, who supervised whom amongst this group, it ended up taking like 15, 20 minutes of every meeting. And then there was this frustration at the end amongst many members of the group about how can we never get all the stuff done on our agenda? Well, there was a mismatch, and we needed to kind of slow down and consider that for your group, an essential element is checking in, the process, some time for connecting. And that allowed really good relationships to form. It allowed for people to be able to challenge each other's points of view, knowing that they respect each other because they had a sense of who each other was and they were committed to each other. They had broken bread together and, and in a very literal sense. And they didn't notice and acknowledge this element of their group culture. So revisiting it and saying, hey, let's just call what we, in substance use disorder training, they talk about call a thing a thing. Let's just call this out and say, so part of the process, it seems to be very normal for the culture of your team to have some time that we've got to check in, or that you all are checking in. There's some time to check in. There's some time for snacks. That they achieved the same professional outcomes. They were as professional as any other group. The culture of their team involved some elements which were not always acknowledged, respected, and placed at the same level as some other teams, which maybe skipped over the niceties, as they're sometimes called, of icebreakers and check-ins and that element of it. Or, oh, we don't do any snacks here, right? Like, no, whatever it was, as opposed to being able to slow down and say, what does this group need? How do they function best? And what is the impact on where we'd like to go? So it just sort of came to mind while I was talking.
Yeah, that's really powerful because it, in a sense, like that shows how unique each sort of team or group or even family is, because what may work for one may not work for another, and being able to really acknowledge that there is sort of that inherent difference, and being able to really develop those agreements, develop those relationships to where you can know, like, this is what works here, and this is how we can really maximize what's working with this group, family, or team. To where, like, once that relationship is established, it then makes the process of sort of when challenges come up or when new things arise, like, you're able to really approach that a little bit more effectively because you've had that inherent built-in relationship now.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that you brought up earlier was sort of like that there is sort of these powerful questions, or there's sort of these different ways that we can start to really lean into some of those powerful questions for communication. And it makes me think about sort of a process we talk about at the Academy that I'm sure you may remember, is sort of the calling in and calling out process.
Mm.
If something does come up, let's just say where we need to call in or call out, sort of what's going on. I would love to ask you a little bit more, like, can you share a little bit to our listeners, just a little bit about how the calling in and calling out process could possibly be related a little bit to the culture humility discussion that we've talked about so far?
Sure, sure. Can I go back for 1 second? You said something that I thought was really
Yeah.
powerful. So you said, this is what works here. And I think that that is an essential element of the humility piece, is noticing what's already happening in a space. And remembering that often we are entering spaces that are already in existence. To me, that's a huge piece of humility, is what if we visualized work teams and work environments as entering someone's house. And I say that, I think of when I'm entering someone's house, I'm mindful of, do we take our shoes off before we enter? We take our shoes off at my house, just so you know. But it's something to be mindful of. And when we enter a home, when they say in Spanish, en casa ajena, like reminding ourselves that we are in the home of someone else. So often in many cultures, this idea of being on our best behavior and taking in the environment to figure out, allowing the homeowner, the person who's invited us as a guest, and even if we're doing an investigation in child welfare, if we approach with this humility mindset of, this is not my house, how do I show respect? How do I show deference to the person whose space this is? And we can do the same thing in work environments. Then we are led to the question of just sort of what you said, this is what works here. We notice what is already working in the environment, and we figure out how do we fit into it so that we can ask questions about, how do you all do things here? What do I need to know since I'm joining your space? And it could be a cohort of trainees. It could be a team that you're joining as a new member. It could be a team you've inherited as a supervisor. What's already been happening here that's really worked? What is some of the history that I need to know? What are the things that are important and valuable to you as a member of this group, right? Like, so all of that exploration, asking some questions, slowing down instead of leading with ourselves, noticing that we are literally entering this. And could we enter it very slowly and very intentionally and very carefully? And I don't think that that has to, we don't have to lose the results. We actually build better relationships, which get us to the results we'd like to get to anyways. So if you're thinking sort of strategically, this is a good strategy as well. If you're thinking in this humanistic way, this is also a really good approach, to be humble, to realize something's already happening here. I don't necessarily know how it goes. I'll follow your lead. I'll notice. I'll be in a place of observation. And then I'll ask, may I? Whatever it is, sort of, can I introduce this? This is what I was thinking. This is what I noticed. And give people an opportunity, in being vulnerable, to check you and to let you know, no, I think you got that wrong. So you talked about your question, back to your question was about calling in and calling out. And I think that what I just was talking about is a segue to the calling in and calling out. So the calling in and calling out really is the difference between, are we inviting someone into a circle, into a conversation, and in ourselves demonstrating and modeling vulnerability to engage in what could be a challenging conversation, what could be a little prickly or a little bit emotional or a little bit something that is out of the comfort zone of ourselves or our conversation partner. And then calling out is, I'm going to pump the brakes on that. We're going to stop right here. So what I think of when I think of calling in is, this is a space where we would really like to gain understanding. We are bringing someone in a little closer and saying, I don't know if you noticed. Like, when I think of calling in, I almost think of softening the voice. I don't know if you meant this. And so we again demonstrate and model and sort of allowing someone to kind of reflect back this tone that we're setting of humility, this experience of being vulnerable and opening ourselves up, which is risk, to say, I'm not sure if you meant, if you meant any disrespect. I'm not sure if it sounded to you this way. However, this is what I heard. Right? Because so then even in this calling in, even this inviting somebody into a closer conversation and to check their intentions and to share the impact of their words, we are creating a space where they can go, ooh, yeah, that's not what I meant. I kind of misstepped. Let's talk about this some more. And we can often, in the break, in the fracture, in the space in between, we can create a connection. There's this beautiful Japanese form of pottery, which is made from broken, I forget what it's called. I always miss the name. You pause.
Kitsuge.
Yes, right. And so this idea is that there's this broken pot, right? These broken pieces of dishware or different things, and they're put back together with this beautiful gold and glue. So much. And I think of calling in as an example and a demonstration of that, where there's been a break, there's been a fracture, a rupture, a miscommunication, a misunderstanding. And the person who may have experienced the harm or they assume good intention. They really want this to be resolved and they trust that their partner will be open to the conversation. So we take the one partner who was on one side, like they say this was a whole vase and there was a break, whether something was said or done. And you've got one chunk here of this piece of pottery and one chunk there, and we're putting it back together. And what's beautiful about that art form is that the glue and the binding that connects the two pieces back together is made of like this got this gold and the shimmer in it. So this is the conversation of calling in. To me, that's the magic that happens in calling in. I demonstrate vulnerability and letting you know how I feel when I could have just sort of shrugged it off and kept on pushing, maybe shoved down the emotion or held some kind of frustration or irritability or just even disrespected myself and minimizing, well, it wasn't a big deal when it was a big deal to me. And I could have carried on. This person didn't even have any knowledge, and they definitely, wouldn't have wanted to have there be any fracture, any rupture. So that gold, that little bit of sparkle and little shimmer, is the interaction between these two individuals when they both come back into the circle, when they both place those two pieces back together, and have a true, honest exchange about here's what I heard, and here's the impact on me. Tell me what I missed. And you might have heard exactly what they meant to say. And we can still have a conversation about impact, right? They might have said, yeah, no. So I don't want this to sound like, and then you say, oh, yes, I didn't mean it. And it's all beautiful. They may go, no, that's what I said. From where I sit, this is the point of view. And if we're respecting each other, I can go, ooh, that's problematic for me. Here's what of my identity you kind of hit me, and here's what's activated. Here's a concern. Here's how it might be perceived by someone else. And I respect you enough to bring this to you. And again, this is work for people who maybe are conflict avoidance because this is very direct. But it's this sort of soft approach. And in the form of art, I can't say, and you said it earlier, this vase is put back together with this gold and this beautiful, and you all can Google it. And it is now more beautiful and stronger and more unique than it was before the rupture, before the break. And I think that that's what calling in is. We're inviting someone back into this circle of communication, this circle of conversation, this circle of respect and relationship. And when we can repair something in a relationship, we kind of strengthen that bond. Because then I can go, oh, the last time that was really scary. That was kind of intense. We maybe didn't even resolve everything, but I know that Charlie's open to it. So I'm willing to revisit if there's an error in the workflow, if there's a question, if there's something tough we got to move through, because it doesn't have to always be big cultural stuff or big racial or ethnic or religious or whatever stuff. It could be the flow of our work. It could be the tone with how we're engaging or talking or resolving, or your timeliness. Like, hey, I love you, man, but I usually get this done by this date, and then you're sliding in at the cutoff, and I'm stressed out. We could talk through that, right? And the other piece of that, which is the calling out to me, I visualize that as a really hard and fast barrier, a line that says, I don't know that I'm ready to talk about this now, but this will not do. My hope when we use the calling out is that we actually revisit it and attempt to engage in the calling in when we're emotionally regulated enough to do so, or when there's space, or maybe even sometime when there's a third party. And I always encourage direct communication, but maybe there's a third party who's a cultural bridge, or who knows the other party, who says, here's what you might have missed. Like, here's a connection. In this situation that could be helpful in the communication. So the calling out is, to me, I see as very protective, very much drawing a line in the sand, very much establishing a boundary for the sake of physical or emotional safety, and saying, this is what we are not going to allow in this space. And it takes a lot to do the calling out. Sometimes that's really, really direct and feels uncomfortable. And the challenge of calling out is it doesn't always have a space unless you're actively doing some real deep work. to do the placing of the gold and putting the pieces of this pottery back together.
I always love that you bring in analogies because they click so well. I mean, I love that you brought up pronounced kintsugi, like because it translates to golden repair or golden joinery. And the beauty of that is just like if we are intentional about this work, if we are really trying to practice from a cultural humility and cultural responsiveness lens, like the outcome of that, the impact of that can be sort of a repaired and refined relationship with whomever we're connecting with, be that our peer, be that our supervisor or the family or others that we're working with. And so like, being able to really do our own deep work, being able to honor ourselves and others identities and culture, and then also being able to have that space where it's going to get hard, and how do we embrace that and still be able to walk out of it in a way where, yeah, we're going to move forward, we're going to become better for it too.
Yeah, I love that you started with ourselves, because I often look outward and want to and think about the kintsugi piece with someone else. But there are times when, and when you said ourselves, and now that I can think back in a not so distant past, where I was calling someone in, but it was a repair for myself. I couldn't continue to engage in the relationship, in the workplace, in the way that it was operating, and respect myself. Like, I just don't move like this. And I can't do the artificial harmony anymore. And I don't want to disrespect myself or the other person by continuing to sort of tap dance around the issue. And I needed to do the work, which was sort of this reconciliation with the other person to honor how I moved in space. And one of the benefits was I also, and I think that I got good feedback that this is kind of where we got to. I also was able to demonstrate respect to the other person, because we moved through many conversations over a period of many months and just little increments, because it's not always going to be big, everything's beautiful. We moved through this process where, to me, it was a demonstration of respect to the other person. I respect you enough to bring this to you. I respect you enough to believe and honor our ability to have these difficult conversations, because I know that even if we never agree and we never perfectly align, you have gifts, you have talents, you have skills, you have wisdom to share with me, that I can filter out some of the nonsense if we can find some common way of communicating. And I don't want to miss out on that. So it's an opportunity to do reconciliation with ourselves, to honor ourselves, and um, to do that work with someone else. But I think that a lot of it is checking for our own readiness. Are we in the survival window? What is the value of this relationship to us? I mean, good old scaling question is always nice. What is scaling in my confidence to engage in this, my readiness to engage in this conversation? Who do I need to be in communication with? Um, what are my assumptions? What values are being, activated, triggered, or am I being hidden? And then for me, I like to also ask, how am I contributing to the problem that I'm trying to solve? Because we got to own our part. Oftentimes we're working against ourselves, or we are contributing to this thing that it's easier to look outside and go, oh, over there, they're doing that. Or, oh, I noticed. And what in my reaction, in my avoidance, in my approach, even in my assumptions, is contributing to the lack of resolution or contributing to sort of this larger issue. And then how do I do my part simultaneously while working in this other vein?
Wow. I mean, we've had a very robust and rich conversation today for sure.
Yeah.
And I think it at least gives our listeners sort of a starting point for where they can
Hmm.
start to look at and lean into some of that work that is part of culture humility and cultural responsiveness. And I would say, at least this being a starting point, before we sort of wrap up our time today, like what are maybe some final takeaways? What are some other areas that maybe you would recommend for listeners to start to either look more into or start to reflect on? Yeah.
Oh, that's a good question. I think Visions Inc. has the multicultural guidelines for communication. It's pretty much a good sort of skeleton, sort of a good foundation of a few different considerations for engaging in conversations cross culturally. I would invite everyone to consider what is their culture, really to ask them. So when you think about culture, you think about yourself, what what rises to the top in terms of what your culture is. And I would challenge you all to go deeper than race or ethnicity. I think that often people go, oh, race or ethnicity. Think a little bit deeper. Is there a faith tradition? Is there a communication style? Is there some gender embodiment of culture? Is there some orientation or identity element? And think about and really maybe dig into a little bit the idea of intersectionality. Another great element of that for sort of next steps. And a lot of this is beginning with you stuff. Consider your communication style. There's just so much good stuff. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I would also consider who are you in community with? Who are the folks that you can ask questions of and have some conversations with to try on and practice some of these pieces before you get into a really challenging situation and need to show up and, you know, be at a perfect level of performance when you haven't, like you got your training wheels on, like just try it out easy with somebody who you trust to engage in some of these conversations. I'm trying to think of what else. So multicultural guidelines, asking yourself some questions about how you see yourselves in the context of culture, thinking about your communication style. Trying to think of what else. Taking a little bit of an assessment stock of your workspace and understanding a little bit about the culture of your team or your organization, I think is a really good starting place. And considering how does that mesh with or fit with or not fit with your own cultural leanings and approach is a good start. Yeah, there's so much good stuff out there.
Yeah. And I think that that's sort of the beauty of this process, is that there is so much out there, and that we may never arrive to that point where we say, you know what, we got the culture humility badge, like we're good, we're gonna check this off, we've accomplished this, because I think that's not, it's gonna be never ending. It's gonna be, like we talked about earlier, evolving. It's gonna be developing, and it's something that we're constantly developing within ourselves, and how we connect with others. And so I think, if anything, this is at least a starting point, some places to sort of look into or reflect on.
Yeah. Oh, Charlie, as you were talking, it made me think about the idea of differences. I think that's another good place to go. There is this urgency and this support for finding similarities in everything and in everyone and cross culturally. And there's so much beauty and excitement and mystery in seeing differences. First, we got to see them to be able to be able to ask questions and understand, and then eventually to celebrate them. But I think that's another good place to go, is to notice when we look so hard for similarities and ask ourselves some questions about what's scary about differences, what's challenging about differences. What do we miss when we don't see them? To me, it sort of is to this colorblind mentality. And I think that that's some unfinished business of cultural humility, is to notice the differences and then to make some space to hear and understand them. Because in sort of the connection to the colorblind mentality is this idea of, I remember growing up as a child of an immigrant and a biracial person who presents as a Black person. And the assumption, sort of, people say, I don't see color, I'm colorblind. And I was like, oh, got to some point where I realized like, that's problematic for me because you don't see me then because I've got so much color and layer and depth and diversity. I'm a big person and a lot of personality, and I tell stories and analogies, and like I love words and all this stuff that is very much culturally the layers, the nuances, and what I bring to it. Like you said, I tell stories and analogies. I've always got a phrase or a quote or something, like I'm trying to keep them to myself. I really am, because I got lots of stuff. And that's the beauty of it. That's what sort of is the glitter and the magic and the sparkle of me, and of each other. So what do we miss when we don't, when we assume, I don't see myself the same as you? And that's okay. So I think that being open to and exploring differences is some of the excitement of cultural humility work. If we can give ourselves the pass, um, to accept that it's okay to talk about and notice, that special something that each of us is bringing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Janice, for your time, for your gift today of just being, being communing with you and being able to celebrate, like you said, those things that make you unique, and things that make, each individual one of us unique as well. Because like, I think that's, part of why like I wanted to bring you on, was that like that there is sort of a uniqueness to yourself that, and it's just sort of one part of it being, the things that you talked about today, the analogies, the stories, the connections that you brought up today, like that's one part of just what makes you who you are, and what makes, even each of our guests that we bring on, like there's each piece of them that makes them unique, that we want to celebrate and being able to highlight in our episodes. So I definitely want to say thank you so much, Janice, for being on here today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It has been my honor, my pleasure, and my great joy. I'm energized, and I'm really grateful for the time and the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, listeners. Well, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Academy i3 podcast. We'll be back with you for another episode, and we'll see you next time.